This next piece of meat that we're going to remove is the ham. We're going to make some delicious steaks from that. And I'm going to remove this muscle by cutting around the hip bone here. But before we do that, Al, would you show them this white piece of meat or white piece of tissue, just to emphasize that again? And I'll slice it off so we can get it off the deer. And I like to get as much of this as I possibly can off of the hams before we go. Now, what is this stuff we're removing here again?
This is called the fill. Okay. It is something that is almost paper-like, parchment paper-like, and it contains much of the undesirable flavor of the venison. So either now or when we're portioning this, as much of this as we can remove, the better off we'll be. Okay?
Okay. Now what I've done is, following the same procedure that we've been using, I'm cutting a long bone, keeping the edge of my knife against the bone of the deer so that I'm separating meat from bone. And you'll notice I cut along the backbone, around this bone here at the hip, so that I can remove the meat of the deer from the hip, from this hip joint. Let's turn it around this way and work from the other side. Here I'm going to seam. You can see I'm cutting muscle from muscle. I'm not actually cutting muscle tissue, but I'm cutting between two muscles to separate them. And then I'm going to continue cutting along the backbone. And as I cut through here, and as I cut along the hip bone rather, I come to this ball and socket joint. You can see the ball, and here's the socket. And when I cut this tendon now that holds that joint together, this part of the deer will drop down that Al's holding, and that'll free this ham, or the leg muscle, from the rest of the deer. So I'm going to cut that. And now we have this part of the deer, the ham, which we're going to make some really good steaks from, free from the rest of the carcass. And I'm going to remove this, Al, and I'm going to ask if you'll show us then how to butcher this piece of meat.
Sure. One last point here, and that is on the other leg, or ham, if you will.
Yes.
You can see the gunshot area or whatever. And if we were taking this this piece off, one of the rules of thumb was your first loss is your best loss.
That's right.
And ruthless trimming and throwing away. Anything that's bloody like this should not go into hamburger or sausage making. It needs to be thrown away. And then you will have the proper type of venison that each consumer is looking for. Right.
It's no point in saving that, because that's just going to produce an off flavor for the rest of the meat and spoil people's opinion of venison.
Now, Glenn, let me tell you what I'm going to do very quickly. This time I'm going, instead of removing the bone here, and then here, I'm going to remove the leg muscle here, with the understanding that later we will bone this shank muscle out.
And then this will be grind meat for
hamburger,
or for chili, or for some sort of
sausage or whatever. And then we will seam these tissues and remove the one large leg bone that is right here. Now you have to be careful also, because there is a knee bone or a patella there, and that will also have to be carefully removed.
Okay, so you cut that back piece of muscle from the leg, and you're cutting now around the knee joint. Okay, and this is shank meat that we'll debone at a later time and clean up, cut out this white heavy stuff, and this will be meat for the grinder.
Correct.
And let me get this out of the way. Now you're cutting between two pieces of meat. to remove this bone?
2 muscles.
Once again, seaming between 2 muscles.
Correct. And we will find that bone.
And this is the kneecap that you're cutting out, cutting around. And so this was attached to the hip. This is the ball and socket joint. And that major bone, the bone from the hip to the knee,
One last swipe on the steel here.
and we've cut that leg bone free. Okay, here was the joint at the hip, and here was the joint to the knee. And there's the kneecap right there, and that's been cut free.
And there's the entire round. A little bit of trimming discoloration here.
Mm-hmm.
Some of that fell or paper-like material again. Now, we will further separate these muscles so that they can be portioned, because these
Now,
are muscles.
Let's show how you're doing that, because that's so hard to do when you haven't done it. You're cutting in the joint between 2 muscles. You're not actually cutting muscle.
I'm not cutting the muscle. I'm only seaming the muscle.
Okay, now could you show me here where can we hold this up and show me where that joint is?
You see, I hardly need to use a knife other than to
Oh, yeah.
take this blue tissue,
Okay.
and this animal is so lean that we can very quickly seam and remove the various subprimals, if you will. Now,
Okay.
Glenn, what we have here is a top round. We have a bottom round, which includes the eye of the round, and that's the muscle here. You can see the road map here if you want to seam that further. That's the cutter's call. This muscle then is not as tender as the top loin muscle, but will look very much and could be butterflied like a top loin muscle, but it is still something that could be used for dry heat cooking. Many times of the muscles that we have here, the top round, the bottom round, the sirloin, and the sirloin tip, the muscles I have in front are more for dry heat cooking. This is the less tender muscle, and if you think of it, the thinner cuts, thinner muscles also. But then each of these can be portioned. Let me start with the round muscle, and I'll begin by portioning 2 or 3 of these muscles.
Okay, now notice you're cutting this on the angle. Why are you cutting it on the angle?
Well, I'm cutting it on the angle just to, again, to give myself just a little bit more plate cover.
Okay.
If you look at the muscles, though, I'm actually almost perpendicular to the muscle.
Okay.
And that's important. So we'll have taken...
All right, let's hold up one of those pieces. So this makes a pretty good steak. Not quite as good as the backstrap muscle, but still a good piece of meat for dry cooking.
That's correct.
In other words, we can...
And for sure a Swissing type steak.
Okay.
Okay?
Now that muscle came from this portion of the leg?
That's correct.
That's the portion that came from?
Yes.
Okay.
Now this portion
is from the inside. Okay.
It's either the top round or the inside round. Now again, this is something that we can stake. I generally stake across the face like this.
All right.
And then again, in terms of thickness, it becomes the cutter's call as to how thick you want those chops. I'm making these between 3/4 of an inch and an inch, and because they're so lean, they're almost a little bit on the sloppy side.
Oh, and this is high quality steak now. This is very good steak.
This
and we
is
can
very nice.
grill it or broil it or just about any way we want to cook it. And,
Correct.
oh, that looks delightful. That looks like that will be excellent, excellent.
Okay, let's take a look at the sirloin tip.
Okay, now that's this muscle right here from the leg of the deer. Is that correct? It's this part muscle. Okay.
Correct. And as you get to the top sirloin, that's up toward your hip muscle.
Right up in here. Okay.
Okay, now we're going to take the sirloin tip. This is not quite as tender as some of our sirloin muscles. Oftentimes this first cut has a little bit more connective tissue or whatever. Some people will make this into shish kebabs.
Oh, yes.
Or something like that.
Or that can go into your grind meat.
That's correct.
Okay.
And they will also do the same for the back side or the again, the less tender side where the muscles come together, the thinner muscles. But if you look here, these are very nice large muscles, and now something that could be easily portioned.
Oh, yes.
Now, if you were going to a restaurant here and get something like this steak would often be merchandised as a sizzler steak.
Okay.
Okay? So we'll put that here. Now, the sirloin on this animal is quite small, the way we've cut it, and we could have cut less off the sirloin tip and more on the sirloin. I chose to do it differently. In this particular case, we could portion this as I described there, or as I'm showing you. First thing I'm going to do is remove that hair that we missed and that contamination. And that's going to be something we throw out with the bones or whatever. And the fact is, let's put it with this trimming, undesirable trimming here. What I'm going to do with this muscle, instead of making it into a steak, because it's so small, is I'm going to chunk it into kebab meat.
Oh, okay.
Now, this is kind of unusual. A lot of people will say, well, that's just a fancy name for stew. Okay. My comment is to a certain extent that's true, but you will find that 1 ounce portions like this on a stick with mushrooms, onions, and bell peppers, 4 ounces of meat, 2 ounces of vegetable, and your
excellent kebab.
You have a good serving. If you want a larger serving, you're talking about another 2 ounces of meat and 2 more ounces of vegetable, and you're right up there between an 8 and 10 ounce kebab.
And wonderful, wonderful meat to serve over a charcoal grill in the summertime.
That's right. Also can be marinated.
Okay, Al, what do we do with some of these other cuts of meat? Let's start with this flank meat that I'm removing from the backbone, and I'm going to remove here from the rib. What might we do with this flank meat? Anything? What would you suggest about that?
Well, once you've removed this connective tissue and fill again, this can be grinding material for sausage meat.
Okay.
If it were from a larger animal, some people will marinate this and use a marinated flank steak or something like that. I would say 80 to 95%, however, will grind this material for sausage or burger.
Okay.
What I generally recommend doing is removing as much of the red and the rib as you can and make that into a burger or a sausage product. And I would say, again, most of this goes into sausage material along with the material from the neck bone because that is very thin muscle, like muscle from the shank. And that material then is ground and further processed into sausage.
So this is basically sausage, burger, grind meat rather than anything else from the neck.
Yes.
Okay. Now, would you quickly review for us once again all these cuts of meat? And can we go over those real quick so that we can see them one more time?
Okay. I'm going to use my knife as a pointer. Right. Here we have a shoulder roast.
Now that you finished tying up for us?
Yes. Okay. We've got the round muscles here. Here we've got the kebab muscles from the sirloin, and again, possibly something that we can either use for stewing or for kebab from the sirloin tip. 2 sirloin tip steaks
from here.
Okay, we've got the top round and the top round muscles, and see how nice and large those steaks
yes.
are. That's a large muscle. The bottom round, which includes the eye of the round and the flat, if you will, that could be further seamed. We've chosen not to today. Then we've got the tenderloin and the loin, the back strap or the top loin steak. We've made some butterflies chops, some individual ribeye chops. We've got a portion of the loin left over for roasting, all dry heat cookery, or some medallions. We've also made some medallions out of the tenderloin and left part of the tenderloin. That leaves us the liver, which we have some liver steaks here, and also some heart muscle if you choose to cook heart.